Jason Miller is a 32-year-old African-American man who lives in a big city and works for a charity that helps the homeless. His work is not only a profession, but also a vocation. He grew up in a poor neighborhood and always wanted to help people in difficult circumstances. Jason is a conscientious and humble man who quietly does his job without demanding recognition. Despite his achievements, he often faces bias at work and in society, but tries to remain optimistic. If you are interested in Jason's story, please like and subscribe to the channel. You will greatly help in the development. Thanks. Jason had a difficult day. There were more and more jobs at the charity center, and people seeking help were exhausted from living on the streets. He distributed food, helped to find temporary shelters and tried to maintain the morale of those who no longer believed in improving their lives. By the end of the day, Jason felt tired, but he was always warmed by the realization that he was doing something important. On the way home, he decided to stop at a small grocery store on the corner. This store was well known to him, small, cozy, with products at reasonable prices. Jason liked to come here after work to buy something for dinner. The store was a place where he often met people from his neighborhood, and he always felt comfortable here, despite the frequent suspicion from employees. Once inside, Jason took a basket and, as usual, began to slowly collect food, some fresh bread, a pack of milk, some vegetables for a salad. The store was sparsely populated, a couple of customers were quietly wandering through the rows, and an elderly man in a worn raincoat was standing at the exit. Jason noticed that the saleswoman behind the cash register, a young woman with short blonde hair, began to look at him uneasily from the moment he entered. Her gaze was sharp, almost hostile, but Jason tried to ignore it. He was used to such looks, they had to be caught too often, especially in stores, where his appearance aroused people's preconceived suspicions. Jason selected some fruits and headed to the cash register. However, when he approached the cash register, getting ready to pay for his groceries, something changed. The alarm went off, that high-pitched sound that always awakens instinctive anxiety in people. Jason froze in place, wondering what had happened. He looked around, but didn't notice anything unusual. However, the saleswoman, who already looked worried, stood up abruptly. "Someone tried to steal alcohol," she suddenly shouted, pointing her finger in Jason's direction. Her voice pierced the silence of the store, attracting the attention of all the customers. Jason felt people's eyes turn to him, some surprised, some wary. An elderly man at the exit, noticing the commotion, quietly left the store, but no one paid attention to it. The saleswoman was excited. Her voice became louder and sharper. "It's him. This guy. I saw him next to the alcohol shelf," she said loudly, pointing directly at Jason. There was more confidence in her tone than facts, but it was enough to make others start looking at him suspiciously. Jason couldn't believe his ears. He stood holding a basket with simple products: milk, bread, vegetables. There was not a single bottle of alcohol in his hands. "I didn't take anything," Jason replied calmly, trying to control himself. He understood that any sudden movement could only make the situation worse. "I have regular groceries in my basket. You can take a look." But the saleswoman wasn't listening. In her eyes, Jason was already guilty, and she quickly grabbed the phone. "The police. Quickly, over here," her voice trembled, but not from fear, but from some sense of moral superiority, as if she had already fulfilled her duty by exposing the criminal. A few minutes later, 2 policemen entered the store. Their faces were frowning and their eyes were cold. They didn't look into the situation, they didn't check the cameras or Jason's basket. The accusation was enough for them to act. "Raise your hands," one of the officers said sharply. Jason clenched his teeth, trying not to panic. He knew that in this situation, resistance would only make his situation worse. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said calmly, but there was already pain and disappointment in his voice. The police paid no attention to his words. "You're under arrest for suspicion of theft," the second officer said dryly, and the handcuffs had already snapped on Jason's wrists. Emotions were bubbling inside him: anger, fear, impotence. He couldn't believe he was the victim of such a blatant injustice. At that moment, Jason was not just standing in front of the police, he was led out of the store under the surprised and wary gazes of customers. Everything that was happening seemed unreal, like in a nightmare that suddenly became reality. When Jason woke up the day after his arrest, he felt as if his soul was covered with a weight that could not be shaken off. The memories of yesterday remained fresh, like an unhealed wound. The events repeated themselves in my head, over and over again: the alarm, the saleswoman, the police handcuffs, the incredulous glances of others. It all seemed surreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. But unfortunately, it was a reality. Throughout the day, Jason's phone was literally exploding with messages and missed calls. He knew that the news of his arrest had already spread all over the city, but he didn't want to talk to anyone. He couldn't find the strength to answer messages or calls, and just stared at the screen with the frightening thought that his life could change forever. The names of colleagues, friends, and people he worked with at the charity flashed on the screen. But none of the messages contained words of support or interest in learning his side of the story. They were mostly restrained phrases: "I hope you're okay, you're not involved in this, right?" No one wanted to ask directly, but it was clear to everyone that his arrest was the central topic of all conversations. Towards noon, Jason realized that he would not be able to avoid talking to his boss, Mr. Parker. Steeling himself, he picked up the phone and dialed his number. The phone answered almost immediately, as if Parker was on the verge of waiting too. "Jason," Parker began, his voice cold and a little strained. "We need to talk. You know what I mean." "Yes, I know," Jason replied, trying to stay calm. "I wanted to explain myself. I did not do what I am accused of. This is all a misunderstanding." The sigh on the other end of the line was long and heavy. "Listen, Jason. I believe you. You and I have worked together for many years. But you realize that it's not just your problem right now. Our entire organization is already embroiled in this scandal. Your name is associated with our charity, and it's starting to reflect on us." Jason felt something snap inside him. Despite his expectations, he hoped for support. However, Parker's words carried a distinct detachment, as if his colleague was trying to protect himself and his reputation. "So what does this mean to me?" Jason asked, although he had already guessed what was coming next. "We have to suspend you temporarily," Parker replied. "Until the case is resolved, we cannot risk the reputation of the organization. You understand, don't you?" Jason's insides were seething with injustice. He devoted so many years to this organization, helped those in need, sacrificed his time and energy. And so, because of one erroneous situation, his life was crumbling before his eyes. "Yes," Jason replied dryly. "I understand. We'll keep an eye on the situation," Parker continued, trying to keep his tone formal. "When this is all over, we'll talk again." The conversation ended, and Jason put down the phone, feeling a painful emptiness come over him. His job was not just a source of income, it was the meaning of his life. It was there that he felt he was contributing to society by helping others. And now he was dismissed as an unnecessary detail. As the days passed, things only got worse. People who used to enjoy talking to him now seemed to have forgotten him. Colleagues stopped calling, friends started avoiding. Even ordinary chat conversations became strained and dry. Jason could feel everyone talking about his arrest behind his back, but no one was trying to find out what really happened. He could no longer safely go outside. Every time he passed by the neighbors, there was tension. People turned away when he approached, or pretended not to notice him. Increasingly, it seemed to him that whispers and discussions could be heard behind his back. They were quiet but sharp blows to the heart. One day, going out on the balcony of his apartment, he saw neighbors sitting on a bench nearby. As soon as they noticed him, the conversation was immediately interrupted. They looked at him with the same mixture of disbelief and condemnation as they had in the store when he was arrested. A few weeks later, Jason found himself in a situation he hadn't even thought about before. Financial difficulties were snowballing. The bank has sent a notification about a possible delay in the loan for the car. Due to his suspension from work, Jason had no income, and his savings began to dry up. He understood that if the situation did not change, he could lose both his car and his home. But not so long ago, he helped other people who got into similar situations. One day, he decided to go back to the same store ere the incident occurred to prove to himself and others that he was not afraid. But as soon as he entered, the saleswoman, seeing him, immediately tensed up. The customers who were in the store hurriedly finished their purchases and left. One man, who was standing at the milk shelf, cast a sidelong glance at Jason and left the store without making a purchase. The air in the room was tense, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen again. Jason felt the disbelief that filled the space with his skin. As he walked through the store, he noticed that people were whispering behind his back. He became an outcast in his own neighborhood. All those who once trusted him, helped him, now feared him, looked at him as a stranger, as a criminal. Returning home was another challenge. For the first time in a long time, Jason seriously thought about leaving the city, leaving everything behind and starting over somewhere else. But his heart resisted the thought. This city was his home, the community was his people. But now he felt that he had no place here. The weight he carried inside became unbearable, and every day the feeling of injustice and loneliness increased. It's been months since the day Jason's life literally collapsed. All these months have been filled with struggle, anxiety, and despair. He felt like a prisoner in his own home, as if life in the city, which was his native, began to slowly but surely push him away. Financial difficulties hung like a black cloud, and more often he thought that the situation might never be resolved in his favor. Every day was like the previous one. Jason hardly left the house, trying to avoid the gazes of neighbors and casual encounters on the street. The mailbox that always brought the bills reminded him of the growing financial crisis. The past seemed to have turned into a hazy memory. Life, when he was respected, and work brought not only money, but also moral satisfaction, seemed far away. Now his life has been reduced to trying to keep himself afloat. On another gloomy day, when Jason was looking through the documents on his case and counting the remaining money again, the doorbell rang. It was an ordinary courier who left several envelopes. Jason mechanically picked up the mail and went back inside, waiting for another letter from the bank or lawyers. But among the stack of letters and receipts, one letter looked different. The plain white envelope had the sender's name on it, Michael Henderson. The name meant nothing to Jason, and he opened the envelope, puzzled at first. Inside was a letter written on thick paper, which was clearly different from the standard forms that he usually received. With a slightly trembling hand, Jason began to read. Mr. Miller. My name is Michael Henderson, and I have to write to you with this letter because my conscience is bothering me. I was in the same store the day you were arrested. I saw the mistake happen, and I have to admit that the real thief, a young man in a black jacket, went out the side door when the alarm went off. I saw it all with my own eyes, but I was scared. I didn't say anything at the time because I didn't want to be involved in the proceedings, and I just left. But it's been gnawing at me ever since. I understand that my words can help you a lot right now. If you want, I'm ready to give an official statement and tell the truth. Jason felt something stir inside him. It was like a glimmer of light at the very end of a dark tunnel. He read the letter over and over again, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. His gaze ran over the lines, and it did not fit into his head that after so many months someone still decided to tell the truth. It was a chance, perhaps the only chance to restore justice. His thoughts were spinning in a chaotic whirlpool. On the one hand, he was full of gratitude that, finally, there was a witness who was ready to tell the truth. But on the other hand, there was resentment in his heart. Why didn't this man come earlier? Why didn't you intervene at the moment when Jason was being detained? His life might have been very different if Michael had come out with the truth right away. But Jason knew that this was not the time to delve into resentment. Now was an opportunity to change the course of events, and he wasn't going to miss it. Wasting no time, Jason called his lawyer and told him about the letter. The lawyer immediately realized the importance of this testimony and arranged a meeting with Michael Henderson. The very next day, Jason, his lawyer and Michael met in a small law office. It was a quiet, old-fashioned office with worn armchairs and wooden shelves lined with legal literature. When Michael entered the office, Jason immediately recognized him. It was the same elderly man he had seen in the store on the day of the incident. Michael was short, with gray hair and old-fashioned glasses that kept sliding down the tip of his nose. He looked nervous, constantly twirling his hat in his hands and shifting slightly in his chair before speaking. I'm very sorry about what happened," he began, avoiding looking directly at Jason. "I was there, I saw it all, but I was scared. Nowadays, interfering in such matters, well, is not always safe. But when I found out that you were arrested, I realized that I should have said something earlier." He paused for a moment and finally looked into Jason's eyes. "I'm really sorry that I didn't do it then." Michael's words sounded sincere, and Jason felt the anger inside him begin to dissipate. He understood that a man was sitting in front of him, who was struggling with his fear and finally decided to speak out. And although it happened late, it was more important that the truth could finally come to the surface. Michael gave detailed testimony about how a young man dressed in a black jacket carefully took several bottles of alcohol from a shelf and left through a side door of the store. When the alarm went off, Michael saw the saleswoman turn her attention to Jason, and the real thief disappeared. But then, out of fear of the authorities or possible consequences, Michael decided to leave without interfering. Jason's legal team immediately prepared the necessary documents for the trial. Michael's testimony was important not only because he was a witness, but also because his testimony confirmed Jason's innocence. The trial began quickly, and within a few days the case was reviewed. On the day of the trial, Jason sat in the courtroom with an impenetrable face, but a storm was raging inside him. Michael's testimony sounded clear and confident in court. In all the months of waiting, Jason felt for the first time that his voice had been heard, albeit through another person. Michael stood in front of the court, swearing to tell the truth, and with a pure heart confirmed every word he said about what happened in the store. The court ruled in favor of Jason. All charges were dropped and his reputation was restored. The judge declared Jason innocent, and he was finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. But inside he had a feeling that this struggle was just beginning. He was legally justified, but people had already drawn their own conclusions. After so many months of rumors and suspicions, he knew that many of them would no longer be able to just forgive him or forget what had happened. When the trial ended and people began to leave the courtroom, Jason was left alone for a few minutes. Thoughts were running through his head about how one incident could ruin an entire life. He got an official victory, but his soul has not recovered yet. The trial was over, but the relief Jason expected to feel was not as comprehensive as he had hoped. When the judge declared him innocent and the charges were dropped, it brought an instant sense of satisfaction, but there were many unresolved issues inside him. Legally, he was cleared of all charges, but in reality the situation was much more complicated. After the verdict was announced, the courtroom was empty. The people slowly dispersed, and Jason stayed in his seat for a while. He tried to make sense of what had happened, looking back at the last few months of his life. His fate depended on a chance meeting with Michael Henderson, an elderly witness who decided to tell the truth. One person changed the course of events, but the damage was already done. He was greeted by a small crowd at the exit of the courthouse. The journalists and reporters who had previously covered his arrest and charges were now standing with cameras ready to ask questions. Their lenses were looking at him, but it wasn't the kind of attention he expected to get. It seemed that everyone wanted to hear his version, but no one was interested in what he really felt. The paradox of the situation was that although he was acquitted, the attention to his case only intensified. Jason took a deep breath and walked past, not answering questions, ignoring the journalists who were shouting his name. When he returned home, the street that had seemed so familiar to him before now looked strange. Jason opened the front door, and the familiar surroundings of his house greeted him with silence. It seemed to him that every object, every detail of his daily life now bears the imprint of those months when his life turned upside down. He sat down on the sofa in his living room, feeling a strange emptiness. A few days passed, and Jason gradually began to return to normal life. But now it was more difficult than he had expected. His work at the charity organization, which had once brought him joy and satisfaction, now seemed far away to him. He knew that his colleagues were mostly on his side, but trust was broken. Those who had once supported him now looked at him differently. Some may have doubted him, even despite the acquittal. Rumors and prejudice have left a deep mark on their minds. Jason decided to meet with Mr. Parker, his boss and longtime friend. The meeting took place in the office of a charity that now seemed like a stranger to Jason. He felt as if the walls of this place, which had once been a source of inspiration for him, were now pressing down on him. Parker, restrained but sincere, offered Jason to return to work, but Jason felt that this offer was more of a formality. "I'm glad it's finally over," Parker said, trying to start a conversation. "Everyone in the organization supports you, and I am sure that we will be able to return to work as it was before." But Jason knew that this was no longer possible. What happened changed him forever, and he realized that he would not be able to continue working in a place where he was looked at through the prism of what had happened. "Thanks for the offer," Jason replied quietly, looking out the window where people were passing, unaware of what was going on inside him. "But I can't go back." Parker looked at him in surprise, but didn't argue. He probably guessed that Jason had made this decision a long time ago. "It's your choice," Parker finally said. "But you will always be a part of this organization if you change your mind." After leaving the office, Jason felt strangely relieved. He knew that he had completed an important chapter of his life. He needed to move on, but he still didn't know where exactly. Walking through the streets of his neighborhood, Jason realized that his connection to this place had been severed. People who once knew and respected him now looked at him in a different way. Even after his name was cleared in court, he felt that it didn't matter to many people. Their suspicions and fears about him remained. That evening, Jason returned home and thought for a long time about what to do next. He knew he couldn't continue living the way he had before, but he also couldn't just leave everything behind. His connections to this city were too many, and despite the fact that the city seemed alien, it was still his home. And then, sitting at his desk, Jason made an important decision. He decided to use his experience to help others who might find themselves in a similar situation. He decided to create a foundation that will support people who are unfairly accused and trapped in a system of bias and stereotypes. This fund was supposed to be his way of taking revenge on the system, not through revenge, but through helping others. Jason realized that his life now had a new meaning. He couldn't change the past, but he could make his experience help others avoid the same mistakes. His strength lay not in winning the court, but in the fact that he survived all these trials and was able to use them to create something more. So, despite the pain and betrayal, Jason found a new path. He realized that while the system can break people, the real power lies in getting back on your feet and bringing light to others caught in the dark.